Imagine this: a busy street corner on a quiet afternoon, the sun casting long shadows, and the sound of traffic humming in the background. Then, out of nowhere, an explosion of tension. A police officer, full of aggression, shoves an elderly woman to the ground, punching her without hesitation. His face is twisted with disdain, his actions fueled by a deep-seated hatred. The crowd watches in stunned silence, unsure of what to do, but this is no ordinary woman. This elderly black woman, battered and bruised in that moment, is hiding a secret so powerful that the officer has no idea what he's just unleashed. What happens next will shock you, because just as the officer stands over her, thinking he has complete control over the situation, he discovers something that turns his world upside down. This woman isn't just any elderly citizen. She's not a helpless victim, not someone who can be easily pushed around. She's an FBI agent, and now the tables are about to turn. The cop, who thought he could intimidate and hurt someone vulnerable, is suddenly faced with the horrifying realization of who he's really dealing with. His entire world shifts, and what was supposed to be an easy act of cruelty now threatens to unravel his entire career. But this isn't just about power or revenge. This is about something much bigger. It's about justice, truth, and the lengths people will go to protect those who are vulnerable. Who is this woman? How did she come to be in this position? And what will happen when the officer faces the consequences of his actions? With the FBI now involved, things are far from over. There's a storm brewing, and the real question is, who will come out on top? But as the tension builds and the truth slowly emerges, one thing is certain: the battle has just begun. What you're about to witness is only the beginning of an incredible story. What will happen next? Stay tuned to find out. The scene that had unfolded on that quiet street was more than just a violent encounter. It was the catalyst for something far deeper, something darker. As the elderly woman lay on the pavement, blood staining her clothes, the crowd around her seemed frozen, unsure of what to do next. Some murmured in disbelief, others pulled out their phones to record, while a few tried to step forward, but hesitated. No one seemed to know how to react when the unthinkable happens, when the one sworn to protect is the one to harm. The officer, still standing tall above her, was a man named Officer Greg Thompson. He had spent nearly 2 decades in law enforcement. His career had been marked by pride, anger, and a deep sense of entitlement. He wasn't just any cop. He had worked his way up through the ranks, earning a reputation in his precinct. To him, it wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about controlling people. Over the years, his attitude had hardened, and his belief in his own superiority only grew. Thompson had always looked at the world in black and white, no room for shades of grey. To him, the elderly black woman in front of him wasn't a person with a life, with a history, with a story. She was just another target, just another person who didn't belong in his world. His actions that afternoon were the result of years of unchecked rage, fueled by his biases and sense of power. But he didn't know who he was dealing with. The woman on the ground was named Evelyn Carter, and her story was one of resilience and quiet strength. Most people didn't know it, but Evelyn had spent her entire career working undercover for the FBI. She had seen things most people could never imagine: criminal enterprises, corrupt politicians, underground organizations, and so much more. Her age was just a number to her, and her years of experience had sharpened her instincts to a level that no one could have anticipated. Evelyn had always chosen to keep a low profile, working behind the scenes to protect her identity. Her job required it. But, as with most things, the past has a way of catching up with you, and she had found herself in a situation where her cover was nearly blown. She was supposed to meet a contact that day, someone who had information on a criminal syndicate she had been tracking for months. But instead of meeting her contact, she found herself in an altercation with a man who had no idea who she really was. As Thompson's fist came down on her, Evelyn's mind was already working, assessing the situation. The punch stung, but it wasn't enough to bring her down. It wasn't the physical pain that worried her, it was the risk. Evelyn knew the moment she revealed who she was, everything would change. The mission she had been working on would be compromised. But there was no backing down now. She had been trained for situations like this. Her survival instincts kicked in, and she prepared herself for the consequences of the officer's reckless actions. The crowd was still watching, some too afraid to intervene, others still trying to capture everything on their phones. But Evelyn noticed something else, the look of confusion on the officer's face when he first realized the woman he had just assaulted wasn't like the others he had pushed around before. It was subtle, but it was there. The twitch of his brow, the hesitation in his posture. These small signs told Evelyn that something was about to change, but what? Thompson, still standing over her, suddenly froze. The weight of his actions began to sink in, but it was the moment Evelyn spoke that shifted the entire atmosphere. Her voice was calm, measured, cutting through the tension in the air like a blade. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" Thompson stepped back, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. His hand hovered, ready to strike again, but his confidence was shaken now. There was something about her demeanor, the way she spoke, that made him pause. He couldn't understand why he felt like he had just made a grave mistake, but the more he looked at her, the more he realized he couldn't place her. Her eyes were sharp, and there was something dangerous in them that he couldn't ignore. Evelyn, still on the ground, could feel the attention of the crowd on her. She knew the time for silence was over. If she wanted to get out of this alive, if she wanted to stop the officer from doing more damage, she had to take control. She took a slow, deliberate breath, then pushed herself up from the ground, her movements calculated. She wasn't just any elderly woman. She wasn't just a victim of police brutality. She was something much more. With her back straight and her eyes locked on Thompson, Evelyn's voice rang out again, this time with more authority. "I am an FBI agent, and you, sir, have just made a terrible mistake." There was a beat of silence before Thompson's expression shifted. At first, disbelief flickered in his eyes. He took a step back, his mind racing to process what she had just said. His hand went to his radio, and for a moment, it seemed like he might call for backup. But Evelyn wasn't done yet. She stood, her hands at her sides, trying to appear calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The pain from the punch was still there, but she had learned long ago how to push through it. As an FBI agent, she had been trained to deal with dangerous situations, but this one felt different. She wasn't just fighting a criminal or a suspect. She was facing an officer of the law, someone who was supposed to protect people, but instead had used his position to harm. Thompson didn't know what to do. He had spent years looking down on those he deemed unworthy, people like Evelyn who had lived in the shadows, keeping secrets. He had never encountered someone like her, someone who was more than what they seemed on the surface. But as he processed her words, his mind spun with the realization that this was bigger than anything he could have imagined. An FBI agent. What had he just done? His grip tightened on his baton, but Evelyn could see the cracks forming in his composure. He was no longer sure of himself, and the uncertainty made her all the more dangerous. The next few moments would determine everything. The crowd had gone eerily quiet now, sensing the shift in power. Phones were still recording, but the sense of danger had grown. It wasn't just about the officer's brutality anymore. The stakes had risen, and no one knew exactly where this was headed. The officer's hesitation was palpable as he finally spoke, his voice lower now, almost uncertain. You're lying," he stammered. "You're just an old woman, nothing more." Evelyn didn't flinch. She'd heard those words too many times before. She knew the way people underestimated her, and she knew exactly how to use it against them. "I'm not lying," she said, her voice cold. "And you'll find out just how big of a mistake you've made." Thompson's hand trembled slightly as he stood there, still trying to process the words that had just come from Evelyn's mouth. An FBI agent, he couldn't believe it. He had been trained to handle all kinds of situations, but this was different. His mind was scrambling, caught between his training, his pride, and the gut-wrenching realization that he had just assaulted someone far beyond his understanding. The moment hung in the air, thick with tension. Evelyn could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He was no longer the confident, aggressive officer who had attacked her without a second thought. His posture had shifted, his shoulders slumped. But she knew that hesitation wasn't enough to stop him from doing something desperate. People like Thompson didn't easily back down. And now that he had made the mistake of attacking her, he was cornered. Desperation often brought out the worst in people. Thompson took a step back, his radio still clutched in his hand. He wanted to call for backup, but his mind was clouded. What would he say? How would he explain what had just happened? The officer knew the implications of attacking an FBI agent, even one who was undercover. This wasn't just about his career, it was about his freedom, his future, his life. Evelyn's heart was racing, but her expression remained calm. She couldn't afford to show weakness now, not with the stakes this high. She had been in dangerous situations before, but nothing like this. There was a feeling of gravity, something in the air that told her things were spiraling out of control. She had come to the city to investigate a growing criminal operation, and her mission was critical. But now, in the midst of everything, the last thing she had expected was to be caught in the crosshairs of someone who was supposed to uphold the law. The officer's hesitation didn't last long. He quickly adjusted his stance, reaching for his radio once more. "This is Officer Thompson," he spoke into the device, his voice shaky but firm. "I need immediate backup. Code 3. I've got an issue here." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. She couldn't afford to let him escalate things further. This wasn't just some ordinary confrontation. It was a matter of survival now. She needed to keep control to prevent the situation from spiraling into something worse. Before Thompson could finish his transmission, Evelyn spoke again. "You really don't want to make that call," she warned. Her voice was steady, but there was a subtle edge to it. She was no longer the frightened, elderly woman he had believed her to be. She was an agent of the FBI, and she had seen the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of people like him. She knew what he was capable of, but she also knew that if he made the wrong move, everything would come crashing down. Thompson paused, his fingers hovering over the radio. Something about Evelyn's tone, the way she spoke so matter-of-factly, made him reconsider. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being played, but he also knew that the situation was already slipping out of his control. His backup might not arrive in time to bail him out. As he stood there, indecision creeping into his every move, Evelyn took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Her calmness, her ability to remain composed in such a high-stakes situation, unnerved him. She was the embodiment of something he couldn't understand, something that was beyond the limits of his power. "What are you going to do?" Thompson muttered, his voice tight with frustration. Evelyn's eyes remained locked on his. "I'm not the one you should be worried about," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "The people who will be coming for you, they won't care about your badge. They won't care about your excuses. You've crossed a line you can't erase." Her words hit him harder than any punch. They were a warning, but they were also a promise. This wasn't just about him and her anymore. This was about everything she had been working toward, the investigation she had been involved in, the corrupt officers and criminals she had been tracking, and the justice that needed to be served. Thompson had no idea just how much he had stumbled into, how deeply entangled he was in a web of corruption that reached far beyond his own actions. The officer's grip on the radio loosened, and his eyes darted nervously around the street, searching for any sign of movement, any indication of what would happen next. But the tension was thick, suffocating, and he knew he couldn't escape the consequences of what he had done. The world around him was closing in, and Evelyn was right. There were forces much larger than him at play here. In the crowd, a few of the bystanders had begun whispering to each other, exchanging theories, but no one dared to step in. Everyone could feel that something was off. No one knew the full story, but they could sense the rising storm. The phones kept recording, the footage of what had happened quickly spreading online, but it was all just a snapshot of a much bigger picture, one that no one could yet fully comprehend. Meanwhile, Evelyn's mind was racing. She had come to the city under an alias, working under deep cover to investigate the criminal syndicate she had been tracking for months. The organization was known for its ruthless tactics, its reach into law enforcement, and its ability to manipulate the system. She had been gathering intel, working her way closer to the heart of the operation, but this encounter with Officer Thompson had thrown everything off course. The punch that had nearly knocked her out wasn't just an act of violence, it was a signal. Someone somewhere was watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to expose her. Thompson might not know it, but this was no random act of aggression. This was part of something much larger. Evelyn could feel the weight of the investigation bearing down on her. She couldn't let Thompson's mistake derail everything she had worked for, but she also knew she couldn't just walk away from this. Her cover had been blown, and now the real fight was just beginning. Behind the scenes, an unseen force was already in motion. The corruption that had been festering in the city for years wasn't just a threat to Evelyn, it was a threat to everyone, and she knew she was about to become its next target. As she looked at Thompson, still unsure of how to proceed, Evelyn's mind began to formulate a plan. She had to stay one step ahead, keep control, and somehow turn this encounter into an advantage. She couldn't afford to let fear dictate her actions. Not now, not when everything was at stake. But as the tension stretched on, there was no telling what would happen next. Would Thompson snap and escalate things further? Would Evelyn find a way to expose him, and those who were pulling the strings behind the scenes? The conflict between them had only just begun, and neither of them knew how far it would go. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, thick with the weight of unsaid words and unspoken threats. Evelyn could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. She had thought she could control this, keep things from spiraling out of hand. But now, with each passing second, it felt like the situation was slipping further from her grasp. Thompson's hesitation hadn't lasted long, and now, as he stood there, hands twitching by his side, she could sense the panic building in him. The officer was no longer the confident figure of authority who had acted without fear. His earlier bravado had given way to something far more dangerous: uncertainty. He still hadn't made the call to back up, but Evelyn could see the internal conflict tearing him apart. If he called for help, there was a chance his colleagues would come rushing to his aid, but there was also a chance they would question his actions when they arrived. No one in the force wanted to get tangled up in an FBI investigation, especially one that involved a fellow officer. Thompson's pride was suffocating him. His career was hanging by a thread, and Evelyn was the one who had his future in her hands. The crowd around them had quieted to an almost eerie stillness. A few murmured among themselves, the tension palpable in their whispers. Evelyn kept her eyes locked on Thompson, reading the way his muscles tightened, the way his hand hovered over his radio but never quite pressed the button. He was on the edge, a step away from making a decision that could either save him or destroy him. Evelyn couldn't afford to let him make the wrong choice. "You don't know what you've walked into," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the silence. There was a force behind her words now, a kind of quiet fury that made Thompson flinch. "You think this is about me, but it's not. This is bigger than you, bigger than me. This is about everything you've worked for, everything you've stood for. And when the truth comes out, there will be no escape." Thompson's face twisted in confusion, his eyes darting nervously. His finger twitched on the radio again, but he didn't press it. Evelyn saw the signs. He was trying to decide whether to act out of fear or pride, trying to figure out if he could still salvage this disaster. And in that moment, Evelyn knew he was only going to get one shot at making it right. The sirens in the distance were growing louder now, adding to the growing sense of urgency. Thompson's breathing grew shallow, as if the sound of approaching law enforcement was suffocating him. But Evelyn wasn't worried about the sirens. She was focused on what was happening right in front of her. The next few moments would decide everything. Then, just as Thompson seemed to gather himself, his hand finally gripped the radio. "I need backup," he spoke, his voice tense, but sharp. Now. The words hung in the air like a hammer about to fall, But before Evelyn could even think about her next move, there was a sharp voice from the crowd. "Don't make that call," a man shouted, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Evelyn turned sharply to see a man, tall and wiry, emerging from the crowd. He wasn't alone. Behind him, a group of people stepped forward, people Evelyn hadn't noticed before, people whose presence was almost too deliberate. The man who had spoken was older, with a scar running down the side of his face. He looked at Thompson with an intensity that spoke volumes, a kind of silent command that silenced the officer's shaky resolve. "Backup," the man said, his voice dripping with venom. "You don't need backup. What you need is to leave this woman alone." Thompson's eyes flickered between the man and Evelyn. The weight of the situation was suddenly compounded. These weren't just bystanders. The group that had stepped forward, the sirens grew louder, but now, instead of reassurance, they added to the pressure. There was no time left. The officer had made his call, and the people around them were tightening the noose. The tension was reaching its boiling point. Every breath Evelyn took felt heavier than the last. Thompson, now visibly sweating, looked around, trapped. He didn't know who these new players were or what they wanted, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. He was losing control. Evelyn knew the moment he decided to act, he had sealed his own fate. The man in front of him, with his group backing him up, wasn't just making idle threats. He was a part of the very world Evelyn had been investigating, the dangerous underworld that was crawling through the cracks of law enforcement. "You should have stayed out of it," the scarred man said quietly, but his voice had a weight to it that sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. "Now you've got no choice but to face the consequences." The officer took a step back, his instincts finally taking over. He had made a mistake, but now he was trying to backpedal. He looked to the group with a desperation that only came from realizing he was way in over his head. He wasn't just dealing with an FBI agent anymore. He was surrounded by people who had the power to bring him down. And as the sirens grew louder, Thompson knew the time for making decisions was over. Evelyn's gaze shifted to the group that had gathered in front of them, her mind racing. This was it, the moment she had feared. The realization hit her like a wave. She wasn't just a witness to something wrong. She had become a part of something much bigger. Whatever this was, whatever these people were, she had just stepped into the heart of it. She had thought she could control this, maintain the delicate balance between exposing the corruption she had been working to uncover and keeping herself safe. But now, with the officer's call for backup and the growing tension in the air, Evelyn realized she might have miscalculated. The stakes were higher than she could have imagined. There was no going back, and as the sirens drew closer, she knew that what came next could change everything, not just for her, but for everyone involved. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. Time slowed, every second stretching into an eternity. And in that moment, Evelyn understood something that had eluded her before. The fight she was in wasn't just about the criminals she had been tracking. It wasn't just about justice, it was about survival. As the sirens blared ever closer, Evelyn's mind was working at a frantic pace. She knew that whatever was about to happen, it would happen fast. The scarred man and his group had surrounded them, their eyes sharp and calculating. There was something about their calmness that felt unnatural, as though they had been in situations like this before and had always come out on top. The officer, Thompson, was still visibly shaken, his hands twitching, his eyes darting between the group and the radio in his hand. He had called for backup, but something in his gut told him that the cavalry was not coming. Suddenly, without warning, the scarred man gave a subtle nod, and the atmosphere shifted like a storm cloud to descending on them. The group, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, slowly began to move forward, their steps measured and deliberate. Evelyn couldn't place it, but there was something in their movement that spoke of a coordinated, calculated action. They weren't just responding to the situation, they were orchestrating it. Before Evelyn could make sense of it, one of the figures in the group, tall, wearing a black jacket, pulled out a phone and held it up, his eyes flicking to the screen. Then, without saying a word, He handed it to the scared man. "Look at this," the scared man muttered as he peered at the phone, his face growing dark. The phone screen cast an eerie glow in the dim light of the street. Evelyn could feel the tension heightening again, her pulse quickening. Thompson glanced over, his expression flickering between confusion and dread. He had no idea what he was looking at, but the expression on the scarred man's face told him that whatever it wasn't good. Then the scarred man turned to Evelyn, his eyes narrowing, a wicked smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You think this is over? You think you're in control of this situation?" he said, his voice almost mocking. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as his words echoed in her mind. What had just happened? What was that phone showing him? Thompson opened his mouth, ready to speak, but before he could, the scarred man raised his hand to silence him. He turned back to Evelyn, his voice colder now, almost as if savoring the moment. "We know who you are, Agent. We know exactly who you are." His words struck like a cold slap. "You've been out of your depth from the very beginning." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. This was no longer just about a corrupt cop or some dangerous criminals on the street. The scarred man's words hit her like a punch to the gut. He knew about her undercover operation, everything. She had thought she was carefully navigating the investigation, gathering intel piece by piece. But somehow, someone had been watching her from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, Thompson's voice broke through the chaos. "What are you talking about? What does this mean?" His eyes flicked from the scared man to Evelyn, his panic now fully set in. He had never been in a situation like this before, not one this big, this dangerous. He didn't know who to trust or what to believe. But it was clear now. This was no ordinary street confrontation. Evelyn had been right all along. There were far more powerful players involved than either of them had anticipated. The scarred man didn't answer Thompson. Instead, he gestured for one of his companions to come forward, a woman with short, dark hair and a determined look in her eyes. She stepped up to the officer and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch firm but not unkind. "You've made a mistake, Officer Thompson," she said softly, her voice surprisingly calm. "But it's not too late to fix it." Thompson's confusion deepened, his mind racing, his body stiff with fear. He was caught between the knowledge that his career, and possibly his life, was in jeopardy and the desperate urge to make things right, to find some way to escape this nightmare. But before anyone could speak further, the faint sound of more sirens began to pierce the night. But it wasn't the backup Thompson had called. This was different. These sirens were closer, faster, and Evelyn felt her stomach churn. She knew exactly who these sirens belonged to. "They're here," she muttered under her breath, but she didn't need to say it aloud. The scarred man and his group were already preparing for what was to come. He could sense it too, the shift in the air, the inevitability of what was coming next. The backup Thompson had called was a decoy, a diversion. They had played him, just as they had played Evelyn. The seconds seemed to stretch forever as Evelyn's thoughts raced. She had underestimated how deep this conspiracy ran, how far-reaching its tentacles were. But now, the full scope of what was happening was becoming painfully clear. The corruption in this city ran much deeper than she had ever imagined, and the people behind it had eyes everywhere. She was no longer just a cog in the system. She was a part of a much bigger game, a pawn in a war between powerful forces she couldn't even begin to understand. A new figure appeared in the distance, emerging from the shadows. At first, it seemed like just another officer, rushing to the scene. But as the figure stepped into the dim light, Evelyn's heart sank. This wasn't just any officer. It was the man from the shadows, the one she had seen only briefly earlier, the one who had been watching her from a distance all along, the one who had orchestrated this entire scene. His eyes locked with hers, and for the first time, Evelyn felt true fear. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't even with the FBI. He was something else entirely. He was the person she had been hunting, the mastermind behind everything that had gone wrong, the one pulling all the strings. "You're too late," the scared man said, his voice almost apologetic as he looked at the new arrival. The figure stepped closer, his presence undeniable, and Evelyn knew the worst was yet to come. The stakes had just been raised higher than she could have ever imagined, and now there was no turning back. In that split second, everything she had worked for, everything she thought she knew, began to unravel. The game had changed, and Evelyn was now a target in a much larger conspiracy, one that could bring the entire city down. The air was thick with tension as the new figure stepped into the light. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest, her mind reeling. This wasn't just another player in the game. This was the architect of the chaos. The man standing before her was someone she had never expected to see in this context, someone she had never even suspected. He was tall, with cold, calculating eyes that met hers with an unsettling familiarity. His face was framed by dark, sharp features, and he moved with the precision of someone who had orchestrated every moment of this confrontation. The scarred man, who had been the apparent leader up until now, stepped aside with a slight nod, as if deferring to this new arrival. Evelyn's mind raced, but there was no time for second-guessing. The sirens outside grew louder, the urgency of the moment pressing in on all sides. Officer Thompson stood frozen, caught between fear and disbelief, clearly unsure of what to do next. But Evelyn knew that the time for running was over. This was it. She had to make her move, now. Before she could act, the man stepped forward, a quiet smile forming on his lips. "Agent Harris, I must admit, I'm impressed," he said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "You've come so far, but you've underestimated the power you're up against." Evelyn's jaw clenched. She knew who he was now, or at least she thought she did. This was Victor Grayson, the man who had been pulling strings behind the scenes for years. He was the elusive figure she had been chasing, the mastermind behind the corruption that had been infecting the police department and the city itself. He was untouchable, and it made sense now. He had orchestrated this entire thing, from Thompson's actions to the mysterious group that had surrounded them. Everything had been a carefully crafted trap. "You thought you could expose us. You thought you could take us down," Grayson continued, his voice dripping with arrogance. "But you were never meant to win, Agent. You were just a pawn in a much larger game." The weight of his words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. She had known that the stakes were high, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. He wasn't just corrupt. He was the heart of the system, the very person who controlled the forces she had been trying to expose. The FBI had no idea what they were up against. No one did. Thompson finally spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. You're the one behind it all." Grayson's eyes flicked to him, the smile never fading. "I'm the one who makes the rules. You, officer, are just a pawn in my game. But you're not a lost cause, yet." His tone shifted, becoming almost mocking. "You've got one last choice to make. Side with me, and you'll have power. Side against me and, well, you know what happens." Evelyn took a step forward, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "You're underestimating me, Grayson," she said, locking eyes with him. "I'm not a pawn, and I'll never be one of your pieces." Grayson's eyes flickered with something between amusement and annoyance. "You don't understand, do you? I've been watching you, Agent Harris. I know you better than you know yourself. You won't walk away from this. No one ever does." But before Evelyn could respond, a gunshot rang out from the shadows. A single shot that split the air like thunder, sharp and sudden. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to freeze time. Everyone turned to the source of the noise, their eyes wide with confusion. The shot wasn't meant for Grayson, though. It wasn't even meant for Evelyn. It was meant for Thompson. The officer crumpled to the ground, the sound of his body hitting the pavement drowned out by the deafening silence that followed. For a moment, no one moved. The world seemed to pause as everyone processed what had just happened. Evelyn's eyes darted from Thompson's fallen form to the group that had surrounded them. The woman with short, dark hair had a gun in her hand. She hadn't hesitated. She had aimed and fired without a second thought. Grayson, unfazed, took a step back, his lips curling into a smug smile. "It was always going to come to this," he said quietly. "You think you're in control, but you never were." The woman with the gun lowered her weapon slowly, her expression unreadable. She turned to Evelyn, locking eyes with her for just a moment before speaking, her voice cold and distant. "You were never meant to be part of this. You've done your part. But now it's over." Evelyn's mind raced. This was it. The end. Or so it seemed. She had failed. The system she had been trying to dismantle was more powerful than she could have ever imagined, and now she was caught in its web, with no way out. But as the woman turned her back, preparing to leave, a sudden realization hit Evelyn. The gunshot, the words that had been exchanged, it wasn't over. Not yet. With a swift motion, Evelyn reached into her jacket, her fingers closing around the small device hidden there. It was a simple tracker, small enough to be easily overlooked. She had planted it earlier, just in case. She had known something like this could happen. She hadn't been sure when, or if, she would ever need it, but now it was her only hope. The tracker was transmitting, and someone somewhere would hear it. Grayson's group began to disperse, unaware that Evelyn had one last card to play. But Evelyn wasn't done. She wasn't going to let them walk away from this. With the faintest of smiles, Evelyn activated the emergency distress signal on her phone, sending a call directly to the FBI, alerting them to her location. Her heart pounded as she waited, but the seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. The sirens outside grew louder again, but this time they weren't the decoy backup. Grayson's confident demeanor faltered for just a split second as he realized something had changed. He looked around, his eyes narrowing. "No," he muttered under his breath, as if sensing the shift in the air. But it was too late. The cavalry was coming. The story was far from over, and Evelyn Harris, despite everything, was still standing. The silence that followed was suffocating. Grayson's confident posture faltered as the distant sound of sirens grew louder, closer. His eyes scanned the streets around him, his mind scrambling to comprehend what was happening. He had miscalculated. For all his power, for all the manipulation and control he thought he had, something had slipped through his grasp. Evelyn had played her last card, and now it was only a matter of time before backup arrived. But Grayson wasn't about to go down without a fight. His face twisted into a scowl, his hand reaching for his gun as he took a step toward Evelyn. But before he could make a move, the woman with the short dark hair, who had fired the shot that took down Thompson, stepped forward. Her eyes locked with Evelyn's for just a moment, almost as if she was weighing something, before she turned toward Grayson. "We've done enough," she said coldly. "It's over." Grayson froze, his gaze flickering between the woman and Evelyn. There was no misunderstanding her words. This wasn't just a casual statement. She was telling him that the game was up, that it was time to end the charade. The power, the control he had wielded so effortlessly for so long, was slipping from his fingers. Evelyn's heart raced, her mind running through the possibilities. Could it be? Was the woman turning on Grayson? She had no way of knowing for sure, but everything in the situation pointed toward one conclusion. Grayson's empire was about to come crashing down, and Evelyn had just become the catalyst for its destruction. "Don't do this," Grayson growled, his voice low and threatening. "You're making a mistake. You can't win against me." But the woman didn't flinch. "I already won," she said, her voice steady, final. "This isn't about you anymore, Grayson." It was then that the sirens reached their peak. In the distance, the flashing lights of several emergency vehicles pierced the night, and within moments, 2 FBI vans skidded to a stop at the curb. A team of agents, led by none other than Agent Carter, Evelyn's superior, rushed onto the scene. They had arrived just in time, and they didn't waste any time securing the area. Grayson's face twisted in anger, but it was clear that the game had shifted entirely. His eyes flicked to the woman one last time, his voice low and threatening. "You're making a mistake. You don't know who you're dealing with." But she didn't respond. Instead, she stepped aside, allowing the FBI agents to take control of the situation. As they moved in, Grayson's associates, the ones who had been so sure of their power moments before, now seemed hesitant. They knew it was over. They knew they were on the losing side. Evelyn felt a strange sense of relief wash over her as Grayson was handcuffed and led toward one of the vans. The weight of everything that had happened, the corruption, the deception, the danger, finally seemed to lift. For the first time in what felt like forever, the chaos was starting to settle. The storm had passed and justice, in some small form, had been served. As the agents moved to arrest the other members of Grayson's group, Evelyn's mind began to slow, allowing her to reflect on everything that had transpired. She thought about Thompson, who was still unconscious, lying on the ground. She hoped he would pull through. He hadn't been evil, just lost, caught up in something much bigger than he could handle. He had made mistakes, but Evelyn knew that people could change. She would make sure he got the help he needed. Agent Carter approached her, a grim look on his face. "You did good, Harris," he said, his voice gruff but appreciative. "But we still have a lot of work to do. This is only the beginning." Evelyn nodded, her mind already moving ahead. She knew Carter was right. Grayson's arrest was just the tip of the iceberg. The corruption that had run rampant through the department was deep, and there would be many more arrests to come. The fight was far from over. But for now, Evelyn allowed herself a moment to breathe. She had brought down one of the biggest players in the game, and she had done it by trusting her instincts and refusing to give up. The FBI was one step closer to cleaning up the streets, and she had played a crucial role in that. As the last of the criminals were loaded into the vans, the woman who had helped bring down Grayson turned to Evelyn. There was something almost familiar about her, but Evelyn couldn't quite place it. The woman had been part of Grayson's group, but now she was walking away from the wreckage he had left behind. "You were right," Evelyn said, taking a step toward her. "But why? Why help me?" The woman glanced at her, her expression unreadable. "Because sometimes the people you're fighting for aren't who you think they are," she replied cryptically. "We all have our roles to play in this world. I was never your enemy. I'm just trying to fix my own mistakes." Evelyn felt a surge of confusion, but before she could ask any more questions, the woman simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the night. Evelyn stood there, her mind spinning. What had just happened? Who was she really? And why had she helped? But Evelyn didn't have time to chase answers. She had bigger things to focus on. The arrest was the start of something much larger. Grayson's downfall was a victory, but it had also opened up a much darker world, a world where corruption ran deeper than anyone had realized. As the FBI team began to secure the scene and take control of the situation, Evelyn took one last look at Grayson as he was driven away in handcuffs. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And as the night drew to a close, Evelyn knew that this fight wasn't over. There would always be more battles to face, more corruption to uncover, and more people to protect. But for now, she could rest. At least for a moment, she had won, and she was ready for whatever came next.